The events leading up to Custer's last stand, particularly his missteps along the Rosebud, sparked considerable scrutiny and heated debate in American history. Few incidents generate as much discussion as the Battle of Little Bighorn, where the focus often centers on its most famous figure, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Yet, conversations surrounding the battle frequently devolve into a blame game aimed at Custer and his subordinates, Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen. This focus on individual culpability obscures a more nuanced reality. No single officer can bear full responsibility for the outcome. The tendency to emphasize personal failings oversimplifies the complexities of the situation and diverts attention from the deeper insights that can be gained. While it may be tempting to sift through the various accusations against each officer, a more productive approach involves viewing the event as a military operation situated within its broader historical context. By framing the battle in this way, we can challenge entrenched narratives and arrive at conclusions that may initially provoke skepticism, but ultimately enrich our understanding of this pivotal moment in history. To truly grasp the complexities of the Battle of Little Bighorn, readers must set aside their biases and be open to reevaluating long-held assumptions. The chain of events leading to this critical engagement did not begin on the battlefield itself, but 3 days earlier, on June 22, 1876. On that day, Custer received his orders from Brigadier General Alfred Terry. This marked a significant moment in Custer's military career, as it was the first time he was entrusted with the full command of his regiment to advance up Rosebud Creek, a strategically important area in the Montana Territory. Historians like James Willert, John S. Gray, and Edgar Wuss Stewart have meticulously documented the lead-up to this pivotal moment, emphasizing that Custer's movements toward Rosebud were influenced by intelligence reports indicating that Sioux and Cheyenne forces were gathering near the Little Bighorn River. However, Terry's orders to Custer were far from clear-cut. While Custer was granted considerable discretion in his operations, this aspect has often been both overstated and misinterpreted in historical discussions. Understanding the nuances of these orders is essential for a comprehensive view of the battle's dynamics. While some contend that Custer was afforded unrestricted autonomy to execute his plans, such assertions reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of military protocol and the complexities involved in command. Although his orders may have seemed to grant him considerable freedom, this latitude was inherently tied to the necessity of maintaining proximity to enemy forces. Custer was explicitly instructed to uphold scouting duties and avoid premature engagement unless his flanks were secure. General Terry's directive underscored the strategic importance of remaining in contact with Colonel John Gibbon's column, ensuring that the Sioux and Cheyenne could not retreat south or southeast without detection. Herein lies the crux of Custer's grave miscalculation. In his haste to reach the Little Bighorn, he neglected to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of Tulloch's Creek and failed to adequately secure his left flank, as Terry had clearly directed. This oversight not only compromised his strategic position, but also created a dangerous vulnerability, allowing Native American forces the opportunity to slip past him undetected. Custer's choices in this critical moment would ultimately contribute to the disastrous outcome of the battle, highlighting the intricate interplay between command decisions and the chaotic realities of warfare. Interestingly, in the aftermath of the battle, additional Native American warriors joined the already formidable encampment. A significant figure in this context was Little Wolf, a northern Saulteaux Cheyenne chief who is believed to have led his people from the Red Cloud Agency in Nebraska to the vicinity of the conflict. The size of his band is a matter of debate, with estimates varying from as few as 7 lodges to as many as 1,000 individuals. Regardless of the exact number, the fact that the encampment continued to swell even after the fighting had ended is often overlooked, highlighting the vastness of the native coalition that Custer faced, one that was likely underestimated by him and his command. In hindsight, Custer's decision to hastily cross into the Little Bighorn Valley fundamentally compromised the military operation, as it permitted some Sioux and Cheyenne to escape to the south. This strategic blunder not only diminished his force's effectiveness, but also underscored the critical errors in his assessment of the situation. Custer's miscalculations in both timing and intelligence ultimately contributed to the scale of the disaster that unfolded, revealing a significant disconnect between his intentions and the realities on the ground. This oversight, rather than stemming from a singular act of arrogance or incompetence, played a crucial role in the catastrophe that unfolded. By hastily advancing without securing his flanks, Custer inadvertently ensured that the tribes he aimed to contain would disperse, rendering it impossible to deliver the decisive blow envisioned by General Terry and Colonel Gibbon. Terry's strategic directives to Custer were explicit, particularly the instruction that if the Sioux were found, as it appeared almost certain they would be, Custer should still proceed southward, possibly as far as the headwaters of the Tongue River, before turning toward the Little Bighorn. The emphasis on feeling constantly to your left underscores the critical limitations placed on Custer's discretion. Contrary to some interpretations suggesting he had carte blanche, Terry's words effectively curtailed Custer's latitude, making it clear that discretion was only permitted when in direct contact with enemy forces. This framework was essential for understanding the parameters within which Custer was expected to operate, highlighting the importance of reconnaissance and flank security in his mission. In an illuminating article featured in Blue and Gray magazine, Neil Mangum, the former superintendent of Custer Battlefield Park, emphasizes a critical aspect of Custer's orders. He clarifies that if the trail veered west toward the Little Bighorn, as Terry expected, Custer was not to follow it directly. Instead, he was instructed to proceed south along the Rosebud before making a westward turn toward the Little Bighorn. This directive was not merely advisory. It constituted a vital tactical maneuver aimed at minimizing early detection by the native forces. Such a strategy would have diminished the likelihood of scattering, a tactic that the Sioux and Cheyenne had honed over generations, similar to the strategies employed by Civil War partisan rangers under John Singleton Mosby. Terry's apprehension was unmistakable. He recognized that if the Sioux and Cheyenne were allowed to disperse, the opportunity for a decisive confrontation would evaporate. Fred Dustin, in his notable work The Custer Tragedy, reinforces this perspective, underlining that Terry possessed a keen understanding of the situation at hand. Custer's disregard for these critical instructions reflects not just a failure of adherence to orders, but also a significant miscalculation in assessing the capabilities and strategies of the native coalition he was up against. In essence, the missteps along the Rosebud were less about individual failings and more about a broader misalignment between strategy and execution, an error that would ultimately prove catastrophic. He understood that the stakes were exceptionally high. The balance between victory and catastrophe hinged on the decisions made in the heat of battle. Terry was keenly aware that the Sioux and Cheyenne forces were not just formidable in number, but also skilled in the tactics of guerrilla warfare. His strategy required a synchronized advance from both Custer and Gibbon to effectively contain and engage the Native American forces. Any deviation from this plan risked allowing the tribes to scatter, an outcome that would not only jeopardize the operation, but could lead to a significant disaster for the U.S. military. In military contexts, the ramifications of a miscalculation extend beyond mere failure. They can lead to loss of life and the unraveling of campaigns. Each order is crafted with a strategic intent, designed to achieve specific objectives while accounting for the fluid dynamics of warfare. While Custer was granted some latitude in his decision-making, disregarding or modifying the orders from a superior officer is fraught with danger. Such actions could undermine the very objectives they sought to achieve and disrupt the delicate balance of power in a volatile situation. The intricate interplay of command, strategy, and execution highlights the complexity of military leadership, where each choice reverberates through the ranks, influencing the course of history in profound and often tragic ways. Custer's choice to disregard the strategic framework laid out by General Terry not only compromised his own position, but also had significant implications for the overall campaign. Had Custer fully embraced the discretion granted to him, He could have applied that flexibility in a manner that bolstered the operation rather than jeopardizing it. The plans from General Terry were precise and well considered. He directed Custer to navigate up the Rosebud before making a calculated westward turn toward the Little Bighorn, intending to execute a pincer movement alongside Gibbon's forces. Yet, in a significant departure from these orders, Custer opted to diverge from this carefully crafted strategy. In the aftermath of the battle, Captain Robert Patterson Hughes, Terry's aide-de-camp, expressed a clear sense of frustration. He laid the blame squarely at Custer's feet, arguing that by failing to scout Tulloch's Creek adequately, Custer forced Terry into a less favorable position, ultimately pushing him into the treacherous terrain of the Badlands. Hughes contended that had Custer adhered to his orders and conducted a thorough reconnaissance, Terry would have been afforded a more manageable route toward the native encampment, thereby enabling a more synchronized and effective assault. This miscalculation not only deprived Terry of a critical strategic option, but also diminished the chances of timely support for Custer. The intricate interplay between command decisions and battlefield realities underscores the gravity of military operations, where missteps can lead to dire consequences, including the loss of life and failure of objectives. In a high-stakes environment like warfare, where every decision is magnified by the potential for disaster, Custer's failure to align his actions with Terry's directives serves as a sobering reminder of the costs of tactical misjudgment. While Hughes's assertions may appear to be an effort to assign blame in hindsight, his analysis holds significant weight. Had Custer adhered to General Terry's orders, the 7th Cavalry could have approached the Little Bighorn Valley from the south rather than through the more challenging terrain of Reno Creek. This miscalculation stands as one of Custer's most critical tactical blunders and must be carefully considered when evaluating the battle's outcome. Custer's decisions during the engagement were influenced by his deviation from Terry's strategic framework. Although some of his battlefield tactics might be justifiable, the larger context surrounding those choices casts a long shadow over his command. One cannot help but ponder the potential consequences had Custer survived and achieved even a modest victory. Would history's portrayal of him have been more favorable? Perhaps, but the repercussions of his disobedience would still resonate. In the military, reputations and careers hinge on the outcomes of engagements, and many of Custer's contemporaries were keen to distance themselves from the stigma of his failure. The reverberations of such a defeat extend beyond the battlefield, influencing perceptions, legacy, and the very fabric of military history. Ultimately, the interplay of Custer's choices, the strategic imperatives laid out by Terry, and the broader implications for those involved create a complex tapestry of accountability and consequence that continues to captivate historians and enthusiasts alike. Speculation abounds regarding whether the post-battle condemnation would have been as severe had Custer survived to present his perspective. The summer campaign of 1876 was meticulously planned long before the chaos of combat unfolded. The strategy involved 3 columns converging on the suspected encampments of the Sioux and Cheyenne, believed to be assembling in the Powder River region of eastern Montana. Brigadier General George Crook commanded the first column, departing from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming Territory on March 1st with over 1,100 troops. By March 17th, Crook's subordinate, Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds, launched an assault on a Cheyenne village along the Powder River. Although this engagement resulted in a nominal victory, the retreat that followed was chaotic, leading to Reynolds facing a court-martial for his mismanagement. Meanwhile, Colonel John Gibbon was at the helm of the Montana column, having set out from Fort Ellis on April 3rd. Amid the relentless onslaught of fierce snowstorms, Gibbon's forces persevered, pressing eastward along the Yellowstone River until they ultimately linked up with Major James Sank's Brisbane's cavalry. Concurrently, General Terry was commanding the Dakota Column, which had set out from Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17th. This contingent, comprising the 738-man 7th Cavalry, was entrusted with the dual responsibilities of advancing westward and establishing crucial supply depots, all while coordinating closely with Gibbon to contain the Sioux forces below the Yellowstone River. Terry's strategic vision was unmistakable, with Custer positioned as a key figure in its execution. Yet Custer's deviations from this meticulously crafted plan would precipitate disaster, not only for himself, but for the soldiers who loyally followed him into the fray. While historians have thoroughly dissected his motives and actions, it is imperative to recognize that the path to the Little Bighorn was riddled with pivotal decisions that shaped the course of events. Many of these choices, particularly Custer's controversial decision to bypass Tulloch's Creek, remain points of heated debate and contention, underscoring the complex dynamics of leadership and strategy in one of America's most infamous military engagements. In examining these decisions, we can gain deeper insights into the tragic unfolding of the battle and the myriad factors that contributed to its outcome. June 22nd marked the 37th day of a grueling campaign for Terry, Custer, and the 7th Cavalry. This endeavor was not merely a test of military strategy. It was an arduous journey characterized by physical hardship, relentless pursuit, and elusive enemies. The soldiers endured unforgiving weather and treacherous landscapes, all while chasing a foe that seemed to vanish like smoke. Despite occasional glimpses of war parties and a few sightings reported by Lieutenant James H. Bradley, Gibbon's chief of scouts, the Sioux and Cheyenne remained frustratingly elusive. It was only when Custer prepared to ascend the Rosebud that the presence of native forces in the Little Bighorn Valley became apparent. However, even at this critical juncture, the exact location of the Indian camp was misjudged, as it was ultimately discovered in the lower part of the valley, not the upper as initially thought. The stakes of the mission were immense. A successful surprise attack was paramount, given that the tribes were notorious for scattering at the slightest hint of danger, which could jeopardize the entire campaign. Custer's ability to capitalize on the element of surprise would be crucial to the success of their efforts. Ironically, the 7th Cavalry managed to traverse the territory without detection by the Sioux. To bolster Custer's chances, Terry made several strategic decisions, including assigning seasoned scouts such as George Herendeen, Mitch Boyer, and 6 Crow Scouts to accompany his column. This highlights how personal dynamics influenced the campaign. As the regiment paraded before departure, Gibbon reportedly called out to Custer with a half-joking warning, "Now don't be greedy, Custer. There are Indians enough for all of us." This light-hearted exchange not only showcased the camaraderie between the commanders, but may also have subtly alluded to Custer's notorious ambition. Gibbon later reflected on this moment with unexpected nostalgia, painting a picture of Custer as upbeat and proud, surrounded by his well-prepared troops, each mounted on strong horses, many of which were part-blooded Kentucky stock. This imagery of readiness and optimism stood in stark contrast to the impending challenges they would soon face, encapsulating the complex interplay of confidence, rivalry, and camaraderie that marked their mission. The column, laden with mules and soldiers, made its way toward the Rosebud Valley, a moment imbued with both hope and an unsettling sense of foreboding. By 12:40 p.m., the regiment had reached the mouth of the Rosebud, a seemingly inconsequential creek that meandered through a broad valley, flanked by imposing bluffs and hills draped in sage. G Company's Lieutenant George Nick Wallace humorously noted its dimensions, describing it as barely 3 feet wide and just inches deep, a stark contrast to the formidable challenges that lay ahead. The terrain proved rugged, the weather turned uncooperative, and even the mule packs required resecuring due to the negligence of civilian packers who had failed to tie them properly. This added to the day's mounting frustrations. Although Arikara scouts like Bobtail Bull and Soldier had been dispatched ahead, they remained close to the column, acutely aware of the lurking dangers posed by the Sioux. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as each soldier felt the weight of what was to come, unaware of how quickly the tide of fortune would turn against them. The tension among the ranks was palpable, particularly following Major Marcus Reno's earlier decision to scout the Rosebud Valley against direct orders. This insubordination had drawn reprimands from both Terry and Custer, who feared that Reno's actions might have alerted the Sioux to their presence. The atmosphere grew even more strained when the column established camp after covering a mere 12 miles, placing Custer's decision-making under intense scrutiny. That evening, during a meeting of the officers, old tensions flared anew, particularly between Custer and Captain Frederick Benteen, an ongoing conflict reflective of their tumultuous relationship. However, in an unexpected turn, Custer adopted a more conciliatory tone, even inviting input from his fellow officers, a rare gesture from the typically self-assured commander. During this gathering, Custer shared intelligence received from Washington, estimating around 3,000 Native Americans in the vicinity, including 850 warriors. Yet, ever the pragmatist, Custer harbored doubts about these figures, adjusting his own estimates to include an additional 500 warriors. This blend of hope and apprehension illustrated the complexities of the situation they faced, foreshadowing the challenges that lay ahead. Custer may not have been fully aware that General Sheridan's efforts to control agency Indians would inadvertently push more of them into the field that summer, further swelling their numbers. This underestimation would prove to be a tragic factor in the unfolding battle. Alongside these intelligence updates, Custer issued a series of practical orders: no more trumpet calls, and a wake-up time of 3 a.m. for the troops, aiming to march by 5 a.m. He granted his troop commanders considerable autonomy, providing basic logistical instructions while leaving much of the decision-making to their discretion, a surprisingly generous level of leeway given the high-stakes environment. Lieutenant Edward Settle Godfrey later noted Custer's unusual demeanor during this meeting. Typically brusque and commanding, Custer appeared subdued, perhaps reflecting deeper doubts or concerns about the impending battle. Afterward, Godfrey engaged in a revealing conversation with scouts Mitch Boyer, Bloody Knife, and Half Yellow Face, discussions that hinted at the complexities of their situation and the looming challenges they faced as they prepared for the confrontation ahead. When asked about the potential size of the Sioux force they might confront, Godfrey estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 warriors. Boyer's chilling response, relayed through the scouts, was foreboding. "We are going to have a big fight." By June 23rd, as the column moved through the first of several abandoned Indian camps, Custer's confidence remained unshaken. He even chastised Reno for not pursuing the enemy more aggressively during his earlier scouting mission, believing that Reno had squandered an opportunity for glory. The day's march took the regiment through a series of deserted campsites, each one a silent testament to the elusive enemy they were in pursuit of. By mid-afternoon, they crossed Greenleaf Creek, where they encountered yet another campsite, this one belonging to the 4th. According to Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, the valley narrowed at this point, with steep hills draped in pine marking the farthest extent of Reno's earlier reach. The landscape itself seemed to whisper of the challenges that lay ahead, even as Custer and his men pressed onward, buoyed by their pursuit. As the regiment established camp amid the sweet fragrances of wild roses, plum, and crabapple trees, the absence of the Sioux only heightened the tension and mystery surrounding their mission. This serene setting belied the impending storm that would soon engulf the 7th Cavalry, creating a palpable sense of foreboding. At 5 a.m. on June 24th, 30 minutes after 5 Crow Scouts under Custer's command ventured upstream, the 7th Cavalry resumed its march. About 2 hours later, around 7 a.m., Custer instructed Heron Dean and Scout Charlie Reynolds to reconnoiter Tulloch's Creek. However, Heron Dean, supported by Mitch Boyer, cautioned that it was too early for such an advance, as they had not yet reached the area leading to the creek's headwaters. By 10:30 a.m., the column crossed Lane Deer Creek, the very spot where Boyer had turned back just a week earlier on the 17th. This crossing served as a stark reminder of the challenges they faced, adding layers of complexity to their already precarious situation. At that moment, 4 Crow Scouts returned with news of yet another abandoned Sioux camp near East Muddy Creek. As the command advanced further south, Heron Dean spotted an Indian trail diverging near Lame Deer Creek. Intrigued, he followed it briefly, but turned back when it continued to veer off course. By 1 p.m., he rejoined the column and relayed his findings to Custer, who promptly ordered a halt. The troops paused in the vicinity of East Muddy Creek, where they discovered the remnants of what had once been the 5th Sioux camp. Here, the trail left by the departing Indians widened to over a mile. As the soldiers prepared coffee and meals, scouts were dispatched to retrieve Varnum from his advanced position. When Varnum arrived, Custer instructed him to investigate the trail that Dean had discovered. Despite his confidence that his own scouts would not have overlooked such a trail, Varnum complied and set off to explore further. After covering an additional 12 miles over the course of 2 hours, Varnum returned with confirmation of Dean's findings. The trail did indeed diverge, but it eventually rejoined the main path farther upstream. At the confluence where Lame Deer Creek merges with Rosebud Creek, a crucial crossing point emerged. The high banks of Rosebud Creek on the left facilitated easier travel along the right bank as the valley opened up on that side. At this juncture, the expansive Indian Trail leading up Rosebud Creek widened significantly, obscuring any clear passage across Lame Deer Creek. The scattered bands of Lakota trailing behind the main migrating group likely deviated slightly, crossing Lame Deer Creek before veering off to reconnect with the primary trail. Historian Thomas M. Heskey suggested that Custer's decision to pause for several hours may have been influenced by a desire to wait for Varnum's return. However, this rationale appears somewhat tenuous, as the urgency of the campaign would typically necessitate a more decisive advance. Custer's impetuous nature seems at odds with the notion of waiting solely for one officer's report. The decision to halt could have stemmed from other motivations, such as Custer considering his next strategic move or analyzing the fresh intelligence at hand. Ultimately, Varnum confirmed that the trail rejoined the main path, and signs of hostiles were becoming increasingly evident, suggesting a sizable force nearby. Around 4 p.m., the last of the Crow scouts, White Swan, arrived with news of a fresh camp at the forks of the Rosebud, though still no Indians were in sight. By 5 p.m., the 7th Cavalry was back on the move, cautiously making their way up the creek. Unfortunately, we lacked direct insight into Custer's thoughts during this crucial time, as most of those closest to him perished alongside him. However, historian Charles Kuhlman speculated that the reports from the Crow Scouts should have raised alarms for Custer. In his work Legend into History, Kuhlman argued that these observations hinted at unexpected developments that ought to have prompted Custer to reassess his strategy. It became evident that the Indian Trail they were following had been created by a large force of Native Americans, many of whom were likely coming from agency settlements to join the camps at Little Bighorn. The fresh signs marked a stark departure from earlier reports of old trails, and while some officers grasped the potential implications, Lieutenant Godfrey noted that no one appeared to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they were truly facing. Earlier in Reno's scouting mission, Mitch Boyer had led the Re-Scouts to a significant campsite where Sitting Bull had conducted a Sundance ceremony, though the site had been abandoned as of June 8th. When Custer's troops finally reached this area, Lieutenant Godfrey observed the size of the campsite, noting it was substantially larger than any they had previously encountered. Yet, despite this striking indication of a larger gathering, the soldiers failed to grasp the full implications of what lay before them. Custer's men had grown complacent, their expectations shaped by the relatively consistent size of winter camps. They had begun to underestimate the true scale of the forces amassing against them. Even as late as the evening before the battle, there was a notable lack of awareness about the additional bands that were steadily joining the main body of Native Americans. Interestingly, historian James Willert proposed a theory suggesting that Mitch Boyer may have been more perceptive than he outwardly appeared. Boyer likely recognized that while the camps themselves seemed older, the trails linking them were far more recent, perhaps only a week old. This insight could have hinted at a dynamic and growing force, yet the prevailing atmosphere among Custer's men was one of overconfidence. Their underestimation of the situation would prove to be a critical miscalculation in the days to come, foreshadowing the catastrophic confrontation that awaited them at Little Bighorn. This theory resonates strongly with Lieutenant Bradley's earlier sighting of Sioux on the lower Rosebud on May 27th, nearly a month prior to Custer's arrival at the Little Bighorn. At that time, a camp of approximately 400 lodges had already begun to swell as additional bands joined the ranks, significantly boosting the numbers of the enemy force. By the time Custer's column moved into the region, the trail Reno had initially reported had widened dramatically, reflecting the growing coalition. Edgar Stewart noted Reno's observations of the Great Indian Trail, which measured over half a mile wide, shaped by the thousands of lodge poles left embedded in the earth. As Custer's forces advanced up the valley, this trail only became broader, at times extending to over a mile in width, with the ground resembling a plowed field. This was no ordinary migration. It was the movement of a vast assembly of Lakota and Cheyenne families, their passage strung out in a column that stretched for miles. When Custer's troops finally marched through the same area, they were confronted with the overwhelming scale of this Indian migration, a sight that would have been difficult to ignore. The sheer number of lodges and the breadth of the trail should have signaled the presence of a formidable force. Yet many in the 7th Cavalry remained blind to the implications of what they were witnessing, a misjudgment that would ultimately prove disastrous. The puzzling changes in the trail unfolded before them, revealing multiple paths scattered in various directions and small campsites that became increasingly fresh as they advanced. These were the unmistakable signs of summer roamers joining the winter camps, a convergence that signaled the assembly of a formidable force. Yet, despite these clues, few among Custer's ranks, with the possible exceptions of Boyer and Varnum, truly comprehend the magnitude of the enemy they were about to confront. The trail stretched an astonishing 300 yards wide, its deep grooves carved into the earth serving as a striking testament to the massive movement of people. Scouts estimated that around 1,500 lodges had traversed this path, leaving behind such clear imprints. While the officers acknowledged the sheer scale of the trail, they ultimately failed to grasp its profound implications. The reality of the gathering forces, cloaked in the shadows of their own overconfidence, loomed larger than they could imagine, setting the stage for the catastrophic events that were about to unfold. Despite the scouts' clear warnings that significant numbers of Sioux, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes had left their agencies to join Sitting Bull, the officers clung to the outdated belief that the hostile force numbered no more than 500 to 800 warriors. They mistakenly viewed the large camps they encountered as mere stops made by a single band, rather than recognizing them as the interconnected camps of several allied groups gathered together. Reflecting on this misconception years later, Edward Godfrey noted that on June 24th, the Custer column passed by numerous campsites that all appeared similar in size. It was an easy mistake to make, to assume these were successive stops of one village. However, the reality was far more complex. These were continuous camps established by various bands. This critical error in judgment was not universally shared, as scouts had undoubtedly communicated the significance of these signs to Custer. There was no question about their efforts to convey the urgency of the situation, yet the message seemed to have been lost amidst the prevailing underestimations of the enemy's strength. What remains particularly puzzling is the lack of urgency in interpreting the signs surrounding them. Around 5 p.m., as the column cautiously crossed over to the left bank of the creek, Custer ordered his flankers to spread out and search for any trails that might indicate the village was splitting off. His intentions were unmistakable. "I want the entire village. Nothing must leave the trail without us knowing." Yet, instead of discovering diverging paths that could signal the enemy's retreat, the scouts only encountered converging trails, an ominous indication of the massive force gathering ahead. Historian Charles Kuhlman later observed that there was no definitive evidence suggesting anyone in the command truly grasped that the fresh trails and campsites they encountered were made by a second wave of Indians. Had this fact been recognized, Lieutenant Wallace, one of Custer's officers, would surely have noted it in his reports. This glaring oversight was echoed by other historians, such as Fred Dustin, who pointed out the critical failure of the command to appreciate the growing threat around them. The disconnect between the physical evidence and the command's understanding of the situation highlights a troubling blind spot in Custer's strategy, which would ultimately contribute to the catastrophic outcome at Little Bighorn. In the Custer tragedy, 1936, Fred Dustin elucidated the situation, noting that there had been a substantial increase in numbers as large groups from the eastward joined the trail. The fresh tracks observed by the Crow and Ree scouts belonged to these newer bands, whose movement over the older trails created the illusion that the entire hostile force was only a day or two ahead of Custer's command. In reality, the bulk of these forces had crossed the divide a week earlier and had been camped along the Little Bighorn for several days. Crucially, the Dakota and their allies likely remained unaware of Custer's proximity until the morning of June 25th, when Ree and Crow scouts spotted 6 Sioux at Crow's Nest. James Willert further argued that the hostiles' reconnaissance efforts had ultimately failed them, underscoring the miscalculations on both sides. This lack of awareness would prove fatal, as it not only misled Custer about the enemy's strength, but also allowed the Sioux and Cheyenne to prepare for the confrontation that would follow. Contrary to popular belief, the native forces were not as diligent in their scouting efforts as one might assume. Their oversight nearly cost them dearly at the Little Bighorn, allowing Custer, Terry, and Gibbon to advance alarmingly close to their village before being detected. By 6:30 p.m., Custer's column had reached a gap in the western hills near the headwaters of Tulloch's Creek. Herendeen, one of Custer's trusted scouts, advised him that this was the opportune moment to scout the area. Yet, Custer offered no reply and chose to press forward instead. With no visible trail leading toward Tulloch's Creek, Herendeen, perplexed by Custer's silence, fell back to his usual position in the column. He later recounted this peculiar moment, noting how Custer simply looked at him without uttering a word. Herendeen couldn't fathom why Custer chose to overlook the chance to investigate Tulloch's Creek. In hindsight, the answer may appear clearer, revealing a troubling blend of urgency and overconfidence that clouded Custer's judgment at a critical juncture. Custer's unwavering focus on the trail up the Rosebud Valley raises critical questions about his decision-making. Where was this path leading, and what unseen factors might have influenced his choices? Some historians, like Kuhlman, have argued that Custer's every action was driven by strategic intent, suggesting that he might have perceived opportunities where others saw only peril. Was he already fixated on the prospect of a decisive battle? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape, Custer ordered another bivouac near a sharp bend in the Rosebud. Though the day's march had concluded, this moment marked only the beginning of a tragic chapter in an ill-fated campaign. It was here, on the cusp of night, that the stage was set for what would soon evolve into one of the most infamous and controversial battles in American history, a clash that would reverberate through time and shape the narrative of the American West.